Hello, members of our Hamilton Catholic Pastoral Region. I'm recording this on the evening before the 4th of July Independence Day. As you watch this, I hope that you've enjoyed the 4th of July, the holiday. And I also just acknowledge that, our country, even with its imperfections, there is much to celebrate as we celebrate this Independence Day, the anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, recognizing that we believe all people to be created equal and that is something that's worth working toward. In this video, I share some brief thoughts on the recent protests, what I'd like to see, the things that, I think as Catholics we would not want to see as part of these protests. And then also a few words on the monuments. I could say much more on that, but I'll refrain myself. And so before I begin to talk about the protests, first, I just want to say that I'm very proud of our Hamilton community. The protests that I've seen here in our community have struck me as very wholesome. They've been very edifying, that they do allow voices to be heard. They've been peaceful, respectful. I really like that the one that I attended on Bailey Square, I liked that it included prayer. It involved both races, whites and blacks, that we came together. It was really a time to be together and a peaceful protest. And so I'm proud of our Hamilton community, the way that we've approached this. And I do hope that, that we do take, steps forward as necessary to work toward greater justice within our communities. And I mean, even in Cincinnati, I know that they instituted a curfew, but I haven't heard much. I've heard very little in the way of vandalism. And so I'm proud of our Hamilton and Cincinnati communities and the way that we've approached these trying times. As to the protests, I want to start with a simple list of, what I would like to see in the protests and things that that as Catholics, I think we would not like to see. So what I would see as a good protest is process. First, there should be protests. There are injustices. The death, the tragic manner of death for George Floyd made that very clear. There are still injustices in our culture, in areas of our culture, in some parts of our country, that require reflection, that need attention brought to them. And also, we have this First Amendment right of the freedom of assembly. And so there should be protests. What else? I think, second, the protests, they should involve, both blacks, whites, and various ethnicities present. Because again, it shows that solidarity. The goal isn't just that, isn't like to lift one group up above another or to lift one up, but the goal is to be united. To be united. The goal is to be a communion, to be in fellowship and with our brother, with our neighbor, with our fellow man. And so, I think it's a good sign when you see, blacks and whites together in the protests. Third, the protests should be peaceful. And I expect that most of them are. It's just the few that are violent are going to get more press, more attention in the media. But don't let that skew your perception of the movement, of things as a whole. That in general, they are peaceful protests. And so there should be protests that they would involve various ethnicities and that they would be peaceful. Fourth thing is they should involve prayer. Especially as we mark the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We hold that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. That the basis, the foundation of our equality is that we have a common Creator. And so we should recognize him in our attempts to move towards a greater fellowship, towards a greater communion. And so these protests should involve prayer. Fifth, there should be a mix of pride and grief and mourning. And along with that, an openness to encounter. I'll come back to this in a minute. When I finish the list, I'll come back to this to build on this, because I think there's something here, that the protests would involve a mix of pride, of grief, and of mourning. And that has been my experience of the protests here in Hamilton. Now, what would we not want to see in protests? And some of these are pretty obvious and straightforward. So first and foremost, there should not be vandalism, looting, or violence, or rioting. You can't do evil that good may come of it. All those signs of lawlessness are not going to serve the common good. They're not going to win the respect of others. I mean, they do speak to, a long-held frustration, but in themselves, they're not constructive acts. And so we don't want vandalism, looting, or violence. The second thing is there should not be hateful rhetoric. This goes from both sides of the issue. We don't want, hateful rhetoric saying that, all police officers are bad. That's simply not true. We have many excellent men and women in blue. There are some that have abused that authority, but we don't want hateful rhetoric on one side, nor do we want the hateful rhetoric that would suggest that some people are inferior just because of their background, their race, their ethnicity. So we don't want hateful rhetoric. Very obvious. We don't want violence. We don't want hateful rhetoric. And a third thing is that as Catholics, we would not want to see communist or Marxist propaganda or ideology. I won't say a lot about this, but the official teaching of the church was given by Pope Leo XIII in, I believe, 1886, when he responded to Karl Marx and in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, which spoke of many helpful steps forward, but it also rejected outright the ideas of communism and socialism. Also, we want to point out that, the ideal of a classless society is a lie. It's very clear in, Russia and China, in places that have gone for communism, that there is a very clear ruling class that enjoy privileges that many others do not have. And oftentimes they are accompanied with civil rights abuses. And so we would not want to see Marxist or communist propaganda in these protests. So again, a very short summary of the list. There should be protests. We need voices to be heard. There should be multiple ethnicities at the protest, because we want to work towards solidarity, toward building fellowship and community. That they should be peaceful protests. They would include prayer. That they would have a mix of pride, of grief, and of mourning. And I guess I would add that during this time of pandemic, that there would be some mindfulness toward protecting the health of others. I've also seen that in our protests here in Hamilton. We want to avoid violence, we want to avoid hateful rhetoric, and we want to avoid communist or Marxist propaganda. Now I want to go back to the pride, grief, and mourning. And I speak to this because here I want to make a parallel with how our God saved us. We live in this nation that is imperfect, and we want to see it purified. We want to see it improved. We want to see it lifted up. Well, we have an example of that from our Christian faith, from the story of Christianity, that we are fallen. That when the human race turned away from God, we fell into sin, and we needed to be purified. We needed to be redeemed. And how did God go about doing that? Above all, he accomplished our redemption in Jesus Christ. And so when we had fallen into sin, when we'd fallen away from what God created us to be, when we fell away from our best, the best of our nature as created in the image and likeness of God, what did God do? He joined himself to us. He was born of Mary. He became man. He took our part. And so when we needed to be purified and redeemed, God joined himself to us. He walked with us. And that is how he lifted us up, by taking our part and modeling for us a better way, a way of love, a way of forgiveness, a way of service, of mutual service one to another. That is how God redeemed us and purified us. And I think that should be a model that we take to, meeting the needs of our day, of trying to work for positive transformation in our communities and in our country. That if we want to purify our nation, we take the part of the citizens. And that's why there should be some pride and some love in the protests, that we love our country even if there are imperfections. Just as, a spouse or a family member or a child, a family member, you love your family member even though you're aware of imperfections. And so there is this pride because we want to take the part of the citizen of our nation. We want to be a true countryman. But at the same time, we're honest with ourselves. We see that our nation can do better. We as a community can do better. And that gives us a cause for grief, a cause for mourning. But in that grief and that mourning, we also see the beginning of a hope for a better way. And so that's why I said that I think that we want to have that the protest should include pride, grief, and mourning, because it follows the example of how God, when he came to purify us of our sins and to redeem us, took our part. He united himself to us, and he loved us, and in that way he lifted us up. So as we, as others, ask for justice, they unite themselves to us, and they express that love for our nation. I can't help now the challenges faced by our African American community are different from the challenges faced from other immigrants. But I do want to draw some parallels, something that we might learn from the history of the Knights of Columbus. The Knights of Columbus were formed at the end of the 1800s, the end of the 19th century. At that time, there was still discrimination against strongly against Irish immigrants, but against other immigrants that were largely Catholic, and some of that discrimination against Catholicism came through with the discrimination against the immigrants. It might have been a little bit worse in the 1850s with the Know Nothing Party, but still in the 1880s, there was an anti-Catholic sentiment. And it was at that time that the Knights of Columbus were founded. And the Knights of Columbus For you'll have to see all of the other things of their founding are a different story. How they wanted to care for the widows and the orphans, and provide for a safety net. But the four marks of the Knights of Columbus are charity, fraternity, unity, and the fourth one, patriotism. Established in a time with fairly strong anti-Catholic sentiment. They made it clear that they were going to love our country and love the basic foundational principles that allow people to pursue freedom, that allow people to pursue opportunity and advancement. And at the same time, work with this country, as members of this country, as with their patriotism, to move us beyond that discrimination. We've come a long, long way since 1880. And so I hope there can be something to be learned from the Knights of Columbus approach to anti-Catholicism of their day by those who are feeling difficulties, feeling left behind in our own day. That the goal is fellowship, that we are united. So that's an idea, a bit of basics on the protests. That there is more to be done. And so we're glad that there are protests. We want them to be peaceful, to involve prayer, to have that mix of pride, of grief, of mourning, so that we can take those steps forward as a nation. I'll speak briefly about the monuments. It saddened me. It alarmed me very much when I heard of, statues and monuments being torn down. There was very, it caused great concern for me. Primarily because it strikes me more as a rejection of our nation and what it stands for, as opposed to that, coming out, taking our part and purifying it. Also, we have this principle as Catholics that you can't do evil that good may come of it. Those are, in many cases, it was acts of vandalism. There are times when legislative bodies have deliberated and decided that it is best to take them down. That's the people having a voice. But to just tear them down is an act of vandalism. It's wrong. And it really worried me that it was a rejection of fundamental principles. That instead of trying to purify our country, lift us up, and to work towards that beautiful vision of we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, all of us, that's something to work towards. Instead, it seems as a denial of those things, of what our country stands for, and the many good things that have been accomplished in our years. And so, just some thoughts to leave you with. A democracy is, of the people, by the people, of the people, for the people. And those were the words of Abraham Lincoln. And so there is a place for the protests have an important role within the functioning of our democracy, that they be peaceful. But we must remember that we do, as Christians, we do not do evil that good may come of it. We remember that our goal is to foster a greater union, of solidarity, and not to cultivate and foment division. And that we should identify noble traits. Identify noble traits as worthy of imitation, and that we are able to do that even while being honest of our shortcomings. That's how each of us grows as an individual, and so we should afford that same merit to those who have gone before us, who in their time worked to make things a little bit better, or worked to, put in place a principle that will guide future growth, future purification of our nation. So thank you for joining us, joining me. I do hope that you were able to celebrate our country on this Independence Day weekend, and I hope that, you will find ways to grow in solidarity with those who still need to be lifted up. God bless you. Bye.